Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Simpilot, and today we're taking a look at the air conditioning packs and do we need the packs to be on or off for takeoff? This is a common question I get on the channel often during my streams, and it's an interesting topic and I can certainly see where the confusion comes from. So today we'll look at why we might turn them on or off, what the reasons are and how this affects us operationally as Airbus pilots. As ever, I am a real-world Airbus pilot, but none of this is for any real-world use. It's just to give you some extra context on your home simulations. We are, of course, here in the fly-by-wire A32NX. This is the latest development version, but for this topic it won't matter too much which version you're using. This will be applicable to any simulator or Airbus simulation that you are using, of course. We are here on the runway in Gibraltar. Here is the Rock of Gibraltar, and we are looking down runway 27, which the reasons why will become obvious when we start talking about the air conditioning packs. Right, let's jump into the flight deck and get started. So here we are then, on the flight deck, on the runway, ready for takeoff. But let's first talk about why, or what I should say, the air conditioning packs are. They are primarily to do with providing air into the cabin, obviously. So if we go to the bleed page on the eCam, what I can see here is a drawing of both bleed systems and then the air conditioning packs. So what exactly is involved here? What is going on? Well, modern jet aircraft get their pressurization and most of their air in the cabin from the jet engines. So let's talk briefly about how they do that, just to explain the context of what we're about to discuss. Modern jet engines are typically high bypass ratio turbofan engines. Now, it all sounds very, very fancy, but they are actually pretty simple in some respects, or certainly the principle behind the operation is relatively simple. What we have is at the front here the big spinning fan, which is where we get most of our thrust. So this spins around and obviously draws air through the engine, and a lot of that air will go around the bypass, around the edge of the engine and out the back as cold air, and that's what you can see this vent air around here is from. But some of the air will get drawn into the actual core of the engine, which you can't see here while the engine's spinning very well, but there is a very thin core around here, which is where the air will go in. And what happens to it in there is it gets spun by more of these sort of fan-shaped blades, which will actually compress it. They're called compressors, and there'll be several stages where it will get squeezed tighter and tighter, and it will get hotter and hotter as it gets squeezed. Because when you compress air, it will increase in temperature because you're increasing the pressure. So they will get very hot and under very high pressure. What the engine then does is it adds fuel and ignites that fuel. So you'll have a bit of a core in there where that's happening, and that will obviously further increase the pressure and temperature, and then that will accelerate because it's trying to escape out the back of the engine, and that's where we get the core of the engine's thrust from. Now, most of the thrust doesn't actually come from that, but what that does is as that air rushes out the back of the engine, it spins turbines, a bit like wind turbines, in the principle that the air is pushed over them and they therefore spin. That is connected to these fans at the front, which spin and continue to suck in air. So it's a bit of a cycle. The air is rushing out the back. As it rushes out the back, it spins these turbines, which spins the front of the engine, which draws in more air to keep the process going. So there we go. Now, before we add the fuel, the air comes in, and as I said, it gets very hot and under very high pressure by these compressor stages. What we then do is we tap into some of that high pressure air, and we put a little line basically and tap it off and send that into the passenger cabin. That air can be just drawn out and then used to pressurize the aeroplane. Modern jet aircraft are pressurized, certain parts of the aircraft will be pressurized. So around the doors and so on, there'll be seals. The cargo holds will be pressurized, certainly on short haul aircraft like this. So this is all pressurized space. There'll be a bulkhead at the front, where in front of that it's not pressurized, and there'll be a similar thing in the tail of the airplane, where behind that it's not pressurized. But the cabin and the cargo holds will all be under the pressurized system. So this air is being drawn in from outside air, squeezed and compressed, not ignited. It happens before that, but it's then sent into the cabin. Before it gets there, though, obviously, it's still very hot. It's coming out of the engine at really high pressure and really high temperature. So it has to be cooled down, and that's what the air conditioning packs do. They take in the air from the engine that's very hot and high pressure. They actually have inlets. There's one here and another one underneath. They take in that air, and then they cool it down and send it into the cabin at the sort of the more comfortable temperatures that you're used to. So that's the principle behind the air conditioning packs. So there's two parts to this system. Firstly, we bleed the air. It's called bleed air because we're bleeding it off the system. So we're taking that air off this engine compressor stage, and then we are using the air conditioning pack to provide it into the cabin at a sensible temperature. So that's the rough principle. As we jump back into the flight deck then, let's take a look at our diagram of that. So I'm going to turn both the packs on, and here we go. So we have the bleed is shown by these valves down here because we are on the bleed page. And that's the air coming out of the engine at 203 degrees Celsius, 28 psi. Very high pressure, very high temperature. That would be no good in the cabin, of course. So this is the picture of the air conditioning pack. The air is going in at 182 degrees Celsius and it's getting spun. It gets depressurized, obviously. And by doing that, it cools down again and we get it back to 24 degrees Celsius, often lower than that even. And then it's sent into the cabin through the conditioning system, which will adjust the temperature with a bit of clever hot air valves. But we won't talk about that today. So what is the implication of this? Well, when we take air from a jet engine like this, we're actually removing some of the power out of the engine because, of course, that engine is trying to use that high pressure to then drive the engine forward. By tapping into that, we weaken the thrust of the engine ever so slightly. So turning the air conditioning packs on reduces the maximum amount of thrust available from our engines. So the most we can get out of these engines is a toga thrust up here if I move the thrust levers fully forward. That would be limited or slightly reduced by having the air conditioning packs on. If I turn them off, we can get even more thrust, the ultimate toga thrust out of those engines. There are some other implications to this. I've now switched off both of the packs and the engine N1 speed is sitting at 19.9%. If we turn them on, we are adding demand to the engine. Oh, sorry, one of them was off, but now they're both on. We are adding demand to the engine, so you'd expect this M1 to have to increase slightly. On the older A320s with the older engines, the CEO option as it is, this was very noticeable. So if you had the packs on, you'd see a higher N1. It's always symmetrical, so with both engines running, the Airbus won't have one idling higher than the other. So even if you turn on one pack, it would have to increase the idle speed of both engines. It's quite a clever system. But anyway, that's just to demonstrate to you that by tapping into that air, we're removing some performance from the engine. So at idle thrust, the engine will actually have to add a bit more fuel and spin a bit faster to account for the fact it's losing some of that pressure inside of it because we're using it to provide our air conditioning. So operationally, what are the implications for us as pilots? Well, we will use the air conditioning packs for the taxi out. In the 320neo, even if you taxi out on one engine, it doesn't make a difference whether you use one or two packs. The same idle point and the same fuel flow will happen for that engine. But you could obviously turn both packs off. That would be the most efficient in terms of fuel burn, but that's not very comfortable for the passengers. You can't have 180 passengers crammed into the cabin with no airflow, especially for the length of a taxi out. So we'll always taxi out with at least some air conditioning switched on, and away we go. Then when we get out to the runway, we reach an option. Do we need the packs for the takeoff or not? So it is pretty common to turn the packs off for takeoff. Certainly before the current situation with the pandemic, it'll be very common. A lot of airlines would do it. And why do we do that? Well, it saves us a bit of fuel. As we've seen, by turning on the packs, we remove some of that thrust from the engine. We therefore are needing it to burn a little more fuel. Now, for takeoff, it's only a tiny bit of fuel, but it makes a difference if you, for every sector of every flight that aircraft does every day, day in, day out, if you have the packs on for every single takeoff, that fuel starts to add up. So it's worth turning off for efficiency reasons like that. So that would be typical and normal, especially before the pandemic, to have both packs turned off. So it would usually happen as we line up on the runway, and let me now show you what it would typically sound like. You've probably heard it before as you've traveled as a passenger. So you'll be lining up and then you'll hear this. So what you've heard there is the packs being turned off, which will reduce the flow of air, and you do notice it. And if you're sitting in the passenger cabin as you're lining up, which is typically when we would do it, it's usually one of the last items in the before takeoff checklist, or very, very late on. You will hear the airflow. You will hear the airflow reduce as we turn them off, ready for the takeoff. Now, obviously, that was before the pandemic. These days, however, ventilation is obviously considered very important. So what we can do is we can actually take off with both the packs on. And that way we continue to get airflow all through the takeoff run and as we get into the air. So there are some things to consider about this. It is obviously going to reduce our performance slightly. So on a normal length runway, this would be pretty straightforward and we would be able to just use the packs. However, we're in Gibraltar, which is a short runway. Let me bring up the charts for you. And as you can see, Gibraltar has a runway of around 1778 meters, but the takeoff distance for 27 is 1628 meters. So this is a short-ish, no, it is a short runway. So as you probably guessed, and I'm sure you can see where this is going, we're going to need to use more thrust for takeoff here. So we'd use toga thrust, and we would also turn the packs off to get every inch of power out of the engines. So that is typical of shorter or performance limiting runways. So what sort of context is there for needing to use packs off for takeoff aside from the ventilation? So as we've seen so far, we would typically use packs off for takeoff for efficiency reasons. However, that has become less normal these days as we try and keep ventilation to a maximum. There are other reasons that you might consider leaving the packs on aside from the ventilation for the pandemic, which would be as you can imagine, a very hot, humid sort of day. If it's a very hot day or you have a very busy airplane, as it could be here in Gibraltar, then you might want to leave the packs on if you can, because that way you can keep the airflow for the whole takeoff. Because even if we only turn them off just before we take off, you'd be amazed how warm the cabin can get, how quickly. And we'll talk about when we turn them on, but pretty much we turn them on as we leave the takeoff phase and we take our engines from takeoff thrust back to climb thrust, then we can turn on the packs. But crucially, there are situations where we don't have that choice, and let's talk about those. So here in Gibraltar with this short runway, it could be that we just need every inch of performance. So we would love to have the packs on, but we don't have that choice. They will have to be off in order for us to have the safe takeoff thrust for takeoff. This is hard to quantify. Usually we will calculate this using a performance application of some variety. So the Airbus doesn't calculate its own takeoff performance. Most airlines or all airlines will use some sort of takeoff performance calculation, whether it's using paper charts or using an iPad app or a Microsoft Windows app. There's loads of different apps out there for it that are officially used and certified and so on. But those apps will tell you, the pilots what performance numbers they need, and also the implication of having the packs on or off, and whether they can take off with the packs on or off. So things that will affect it will be the length of the runway. Gibraltar being a short runway, quite likely we would need to turn the packs off. Other things will be hot temperatures. So if you have very high temperatures, that means there's less performance for the engines, so you might need to turn them off in that case. It could be a tailwind. It could be having high terrain after takeoff, so somewhere like Innsbruck where you may need to climb rapidly after you get into the air. It could also be things like a contaminated runway. If it's covered in snow or something like that, that's going to degrade your takeoff performance, then you may consider turning the packs off. So basically a situation, or any situation where you're going to have significant performance issues, that is where we would typically turn the packs off by requirement, i.e. the performance requires that we do it. A rough guide for you today, and this is not accurate because it's going to depend on so many different things: the weight, which aircraft you're in, is it a 319, 20, 21, the temperature, the tailwind, and so on. But a rough guide, if you're talking about a runway that's shorter than 2,000 meters takeoff run available, and you've also got a heavy airplane, then it's going to become more likely you'll need to turn those packs off for takeoff. The reality is, in Microsoft Flight Simulator, it doesn't seem to make any difference to the actual performance for now. But that's just some context. But like I said, it's going to be based on us actually calculating it ourselves with the airline approved method. What is quite typical is if you are required to turn the packs off for takeoff, if it is a requirement because of performance reasons that they have to be off, then normally that is the sort of day where you're also having to use toga thrust. So again, that's these short runway or high performance issue days. So yeah, it's rare. I would say it depends on what sort of operation you're flying, but yeah, if you're flying from anything over 2,000 meters, it's quite likely you'll be able to leave the packs on unless you're in very high or hot conditions or something like that. But when you're starting to get onto these shorter runways, it becomes more and more common, especially if you've got any additional performance problems. So those of you who've seen my stream will notice that I nearly always leave the packs on for takeoff now. As I said, that wasn't typical SOP for Airbus operators. A lot would turn them off, but more common these days in order to keep the ventilation up, and the requirement to turn them off for performance reasons is relatively rare. You need to be in quite specific airports for that. We must remember that the aircraft, even with the packs on, if the engine fails, it will still have enough thrust and performance to climb away on one engine. That's all part of the requirements, you see. Just the final couple of little anecdotes about the packs on or off takeoff for you. Just from my observations, this is not official or anything like that, but there are some interesting effects you can get from it. If you have them turned on, during takeoff. Obviously, they deal with quite a high change in the pressure coming from the engine and so on, so you can sometimes feel that. You might feel your ears pop or something like that just as you start the takeoff roll, because the outflow valve at the back of the airplane that's used to help adjust the pressurization, that will close during the takeoff roll as we get ready to get into the air and start climbing. And yeah, if you've got the packs on, then you're still providing air pressure as that happens. Also, if you're taking off on a snow-covered runway and you have the packs on, or sorry, on an icy sort of day, where airplanes have been de-iced, you might find that as you roll down the runway, you start to get a bit of that fluid ingested through the engines and into the packs. It's not harmful de-icing fluid, but you can just notice the smell a little bit. This is because de-icing fluid, when we de-ice the outside of the airplane, which we'll do obviously if there's been frost formed overnight or it's snowing, it's designed to come off as the airplane accelerates. So as the air starts pushing itself over the airplane, then the fluid will gently be removed and it will flow off, and you'll see it on the wings actually streaming off the packs as you're taking off, which is quite normal. The result is obviously a lot of it lands on the runway, especially in these early parts when the airplane is covered in fluid, and it starts to come off quite quickly. The result is if you're taking off with your bleeds and your packs on, then you're sucking in some of that fluid off the runway, and it then gets into the system, and you can smell it a bit. The same effect happens if you take off, or you're taxiing, behind a big aircraft and the wind is in the right direction. Then you might start to smell their exhaust because it gets sucked in through the bleed air and into the cabin. Right, that's definitely enough talking about this topic. Let's take off then from Gibraltar. We're going to go to toga takeoff, flap 3, and then make our turn to the left, and we'll head out around the rock. This is going to show us where we're going to turn those packs on. So as we can see, packs messages up here on the Neo, because it's showing us that we have that demand that's not there on the older aircraft. It's only on the more modern ones. But yeah, packs are on. So let's turn those off, and I'll show you when we would turn them back on again. So packs will go off pretty soon to when you're actually going to take off. We might try and delay it if we know we're going to wait on the runway for a while. And let's go. So 50% N1. We'll start the timer, release the brakes. Full toga, so there's Mantoga SRS, auto thrust is blue and armed, and away we go. Okay, 80 to 100 knots, then we'll bring that side stick to neutral. Having a bit of a headwind, but still you can see the challenge in the runway length. There's V1 and rotate, and up we go. Positive climb, gear up. We're getting a brakes hot message just because of the simulator. There's a bit of a bug at the moment, so we'll ignore that. And there's runway track, and away we go. I'm just going to put in the autopilot to show us what's going on. So we're climbing away very well. We've got flaps 3 and toga thrust, which gives us very good climb performance, as you can see. But what's going to happen now is we're going to go through our acceleration altitude shortly. Somewhere here, and it's going to say lever climb. So now we can bring the thrust back to climb. There's thrust climb, open climb, auto thrust. So the thrust lever is now back at the climb gate, and now we aren't in a takeoff segment. We've removed the takeoff thrust requirement. We're already back to our climb thrust and accelerating. So now we'll turn on one of the packs. What you do is you turn it on, and then you wait 10 seconds. We don't do it straight away. We're now above F, so let's go to flaps 1, and let's start that turn. We'll initially turn south. So you have to turn it on and wait 10 seconds, and now you can turn on the next pack, pack 2. The reason we do it like that is so that we don't suddenly provide all that air pressure. I mentioned earlier your ears could pop. Well, that's because the outflow valve would have closed, so the airplane will be pretty sealed. It's getting ready to pressurize. So if we suddenly turn on all that air, flaps now coming to 0. If we suddenly turn on all that air, then it'll be a big spike in pressure. So it's just for passenger comfort to make sure it's as soft on your ears as possible, and the pressure change isn't too shocking. So yeah, and that's how you do it. You simply wait until after you've brought the thrust levers back, which will be after your acceleration altitude, wherever that is. We don't do it while we're at takeoff thrust still. That's pretty much the message there, and away we go. So here we are in X-Plane 11, and the reason we're here is I want to show you the differences with the older style engines, and also we'll have a look at what happens when we forget to turn the packs on after takeoff. There is another feature to having the packs on or off, which I haven't discussed so far, which is the workload management associated with it. If we take off from a really busy sort of airport or into busy airspace, or maybe somewhere like Innsbruck where we have lots of turns, if the performance allows, it might be better for us to use the packs on takeoff. And this is, obviously for getting about the pandemic side to things, and actually thinking about it in the sense of if we didn't need the ventilation, would we want the packs off or on for takeoff? So something to consider is, if it's very busy airspace when we get up into the air, or we're going to have lots to do, such as lots of sharp turns near to terrain, do we want to also need to remember to turn the packs on and give ourselves extra workload, or do we want both pilots able to keep focusing on the flying? So it could be that even in normal times, we might decide to use the packs on technique just to save us from having to have that extra workload, something else to do when there's a lot to focus on. So let's have the packs off. Let's take off now in X-Plane and take a look at the difference. We are using the Toliss A321 here. It does have the Neo option available. You'll notice down here that I get this little status message. This is correct. This is, if I go to the status page, will show me pack 1 and 2 is inoperative. It's not actually broken, it's just switched off. This is what the Airbus does show you when you turn off the packs. So you'd expect to see that little status message there. The other thing is, you can see at the top there is no message packs on the nacelle anti-ice because this is the older style engine. It doesn't do that. It doesn't give us that memo. Okay, so here we go. Let's start the timer. 50% M1 on the engines. Holding it on the toe brakes, half side stick forward. Engine stabilized. Release the brakes all the way forward. Mantoga SRS, order thrust is blue and armed, and away we go. I do enjoy the ground handling in X-Plane. I think it just feels so much closer to the real ground handling on these aeroplanes. I do look forward to Microsoft Flight Simulator updating it. Right, there's 100 knots, side stick to neutral. So this is a 321. We're a bit lighter. We have a bit more performance, and rotate. Up we go. There's positive climb, gear up, and nav mode. So far, so simple. Lots of extra performance here. We're actually very light for 321. Well, not that light, actually 71 tons, but the 321 does have slightly higher rated engines, so it's not quite as obvious as you'd think to work out which one is going to have the better performance. And there we go, climbing away. So soon we are going to be through acceleration. Here it is, and you can see lever climb. Let's bring that to climb. I'm going to open climb and auto thrust, and we'll do our usual flow, and we should turn on those packs, but I am going to forget to do that. And we'll see what happens. Let's pull that heading bug and start our left turn south. There it is. Above the F now, so we can go from flaps 3 to 1. So the airplane is not pressurizing. If we go to our bleed page, we can see that the packs are, this is actually what you'd get. It doesn't actually go completely off like it does as you saw earlier. This is more what you'd expect, which is just sort of set to low. It's just sitting there idling, doing not a lot. There's no air going in because you can see it's just 20 degrees. It's just sort of ambient temperature it was last at. Okay, excellent. If we go to the pressurization page as well, I can see here both packs are in amber, so they're not feeding into the system. So that's another telltale sign that we aren't running with the packs. And there is our master caution. So this was the page that would automatically come up when that happens. So we'll cancel the master caution, and now we need to think about flying the airplane first and foremost. So I'm not going to actually do anything. We're going to clean up the airplane first through S-speed, flaps to 0, disarm the ground spoilers, and so on. So we should have done it already, of course, as we've discussed, but we haven't, and here's our ECAM caution. There's the last 1,000 feet to go, so let's level off the airplane calmly. There's no great urgency. If we look at the pressurization page, we can actually see that the cabin altitude is rising. It's at 1,000 feet, but it's not going to be a major concern down at these altitudes. But anyway, there it is, air pack 1 off, air pack 2 off. So same thing, turn 1 on, then we have to wait 10 seconds while the airplane pressurizes gradually. Now we can see that vertical speed going down as it tries to sort out the pressurizing, and then we can turn on pack 2. And now the status message disappears and we are in a normal aeroplane. So that is the pretty typical issue that can happen if you fail to get all of the takeoff flow done properly with the packs off. So that's all for today's video. I hope it's been interesting for you. Just a few little details about something I get asked about quite a lot, so I thought it'd be good to share with you guys. Hopefully it's made sense, and yeah, there'll be plenty more little tips and tricks and guides and tutorials coming to the channel very soon, all about the Airbus, and obviously plenty of live streams in both the Airbus and other airliners as we explore the world of flight simulation. So do please subscribe if you'd like to see more of that content. Otherwise, we'll see you again in another video or live stream very soon. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.